And what happens if a creditor hasn't received notice of the creditors' meeting? So on the 13th of June, which was around 6 weeks after the approval of the IVA, we got a letter from an unknown creditor who was the administrator of a former company of Graham. And the administrator advised us that Graham had signed a personal guarantee in respect of unpaid administrators' fees. And this debt hadn't been included in Graham's proposal, and this was the first we'd heard of it. So we took it up with Graham straight away. And we found out about the PG, the personal guarantee, and Graham maintained he'd forgotten about the PG. Yeah, would you believe it? 3 separate PGs had been signed by the 3 former directors. He didn't have a copy of the PG. He was unsure whether either his co-directors had paid anything further. He was unsure what realisations had been recovered by the administrator, which may have extinguished or reduced the liability. He was unsure of the legality of the PG. It was handwritten and vague. And the maximum liability arising on the debt appeared to be for £25,000. Okay, so back to the question, what happens if a creditor hasn't received notice? The administrator was very angry. He thought he should have received notice and he objected to being admitted into the IVA. So the administrator, Mr. Angry, instructed solicitors. And I'd have to say, I've never dealt with any professional who was so aggressive and rude as this solicitor. She obviously wanted to impress a very angry client, and I'll refer to her as Miss Nasty, or Ms. Nasty, as you probably prefer. And here's a picture of Mr. Angry and Ms. Nasty to give you a better idea as to who we're dealing with. She's rather good looking, isn't she? Okay. Ms. Nasty maintained that this omission was material and deliberate. As she said, Graham knew that Mr. Angry would oppose any IVA proposal and that the IVA unfairly prejudiced Mr. Angry's interests. Under insolvency rules, all creditors are bound by the approved IVA, whether or not they receive notice of it, unless proven to be a deliberate omission. So like it or not, Mr. Angry was actually bound by the terms of the IVA, subject to my adjudication of the validity of his alleged PG. Under Section 262 of the Insolvency Act, a creditor who received no notice of the IVA meeting has a right to challenge the decision of the meeting within 28 days of becoming aware of the IVA. So we received an ultimatum from Ms. Nasty that an application would be made to court to challenge the IVA unless we terminated the IVA and petitioned immediately for the bankruptcy of Graham. It really wasn't as simple as just filing a petition against Graham. In some ways, this would have been a very easy option. But the majority of creditors had voted to approve the IVA, and we had a responsibility to referee the IVA contract between Graham's creditors and Graham. And at this stage, Mr. Angry had no clear grounds for any challenge. He'd need to prove his debt and the IVA prejudiced his interests. There was a week or so of very intensive emails from Miss Nasty. By this time, I'd actually gone away on holiday, touring in India. And just in case you're wondering, booked months before I'd even met Graham. So I left this case in the capable hands of Emma, my compliance manager, and Cheryl at my office. And just to give you a flavour of these emails, I'll read a couple of them out. So at 1:02 on the 25th of June, there's an email to Emma. I attach a further copy of my unanswered letter dated 23rd of June. I've also telephoned your office this morning and asked that you or someone else contacts me in Mr. Caulfield's absence. Well, a message had been left for Ms. Nasty that morning following a call. that the letter she was talking about had been responded to, and Emma was out of the office that day and would call back in the morning. That seems reasonable enough to me. But the email went on to say, please provide a substantive response to the unanswered letter by 4 p.m. today. Your actions are wholly unacceptable. If you fail to do so, my client reserves his position in relation to reporting the conduct of your firm to your regulatory body. And bear in mind, this was a letter that was 2 days old and had been responded to. So we had another email later that day, 3 minutes past 4. No doubt after she got our message saying the letter had been responded to. Please ask your office to provide, by return of email, the letters dated 24th and 25th of June 2013. Needless to say, they have not been received in this office. And this is the bit I really like. I note that Mr. Caulfield has been reading his emails, but has chosen not to respond to mine. What? As you can imagine, these emails had me spluttering over my biryani. I'd have been impressed by anyone opening emails in the back of an Indian taxi racing across Rajasthan, let alone juggling with enclosures on my iPhone. What did you think? Did you think I'd taken the files with me? So we made a formal complaint to the senior partner, and things did get a little better after that. So coming back to the question, what happens if a creditor hasn't received notice? Clearly, until we could be satisfied that there was actually a debt, there were no implications for the IVA under Section 262. It was a creditor's right to make application under Section 262 if they wished, but in all likelihood, any court would just order a further meeting of creditors to take place, as this is ultimately a decision for the creditors and not the court. So correspondence continued, and eventually a Section 262 application was received from Ms Nasty and a hearing listed. And by this time, we'd instructed solicitors ourselves to particularly consider whether or not this was a valid debt. And this hinged on a consent order which hadn't readily been disclosed by Ms Nasty, that was lodged at court for a hearing which had taken place some years ago. But because of this consent order, on balance, we felt we had to accept the debt. And because this claim had a material effect on the dividend to creditors, we had no alternative but to call a further meeting of creditors so that the creditors could consider whether they were still prepared to agree to the proposals put forward by Graham. But of course this time, Mr Angry would have a vote. The court hearing scheduled to hear the Section 262 application was vacated by consent and the date for the creditors' meeting set. We knew that Graham was going to have a difficult time persuading his creditors to accept again the terms of the IVA. And Mr Angry knew who the creditors were and no doubt was going to make very strong representations as to why he felt the creditors should reject any proposal put forward. We strongly recommended to Graham that if he wanted the proposal to be approved, he'd have to revisit his proposals and sharpen his pencil. So Graham put forward the following amendments. He increased by 2 years to 7 years from the original 5-year term, the period that he was actually paying into the proposal, into the arrangement. And he also offered his interest in some shares and also a pension lump sum which had previously been excluded and agreed to by the creditors. So we went through the revised proposals carefully with Graham. We then sent them to creditors, disclosing the original omissions and the new terms proposed by Graham and the revised dividends. Needless to say, Mr Angry voted against the proposals and made his feelings known to other creditors. And during all this time, Emma kept in touch with the major creditors and kept them informed of the situation. The creditors weren't particularly impressed by what they could see of the unprofessional attitude of Mr Angry. He even offered to buy the debt off various creditors so that he could increase his voting at the creditors' meeting. And after many long telephone conversations, both the major creditors and the petitioning creditor agreed to support the proposals, particularly since they'd been revised by Graham to increase the dividends. So at the creditors' meeting, despite the opposition of Mr. Angry, the proposals were approved and there was nothing more Mr. Angry could do. And once again, Graham was delighted and tells me now he's trading successfully with his new partner.